Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Welcome in. It's a Friday edition of Daily Faceoff Live. Tyler Yaremchuk and Frank Saravalli with you live.
In person, in studio.
In person, in studio, live from Edmonton, where yesterday you were like, oh, it's warm here. It's so nice. Today you're getting the Edmonton weather treatment.
Yeah, but that's okay. Look, this is what it's to be expected, and it's not brutally cold. It's minus 8 or 10. This is hockey weather.
It is hockey weather, and this is a hockey show. So let's throw 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on the clock and start with the big hockey news we got earlier this morning, and that's Austin Matthews of the Toronto Maple Leafs will be out a minimum of 3 weeks to recover from a knee injury. A couple of notes from Sheldon Keefe saying they aren't sure exactly what incident or if there was one specific incident that led to this, and also saying it's unrelated to past injuries as well. Still, Frank, concerning for Matthews.
Yeah, I think the concerning word there is a minimum of 3 weeks. And that's the thing. If you're going to have an injury that takes you out for any period of time, if you're an NHL player, you want it to be right now because you missed the All-Star game. And by the way, he was replaced in South Florida by the Panthers' Alexander Barkov. So an easy substitution there for Team Atlantic. But when you think about Austin Matthews and the season that has unfolded to this point, I've said a few times, we're kind of looking for an explanation of how do you have such a significant drop off? And I understand that his game has been so complete. He's one of the league leaders in block shots among forwards, and he's, really playing the full 200-foot game. I'd argue a Selke candidate type season. But still, the drop off in goals from 60 to the pace of now 44, you're kind of looking for the explanation of what's going on there. And what's interesting is, as you pointed out from Sheldon Keefe, this is not related to any of the previous injuries that he's had. So the idea of that nagging injury that he, said a couple weeks ago just kind of finally caught up with him and he needed to miss a couple games. Well, this isn't that. But I think what the hope is, if you're a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, is that, look, he now has additional time to rest whatever that nagging injury was as well. And so the player that you hope to get on the other side of the bye week, which for the Leafs comes on the back end of the All-Star break, well, then hopefully when you do get an Austin Matthews back, he's ready and he's back scoring at that 50 to 55 goal pace, whatever it is that makes him such a special player in this league. But to this point, he's just been missing something. It's a little bit of swagger or juice or confidence that I think there was this air about him that he was just an absolute assassin last year, where you went into games, he was so chill knowing that he was going to score. And I think you're kind of waiting to see that again this season. It just hasn't unfolded that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the Leafs right now, you're realistically not catching Boston. You're more or less locked into a playoff matchup with the Tampa Bay Lightning.
It's nothing to fret over.
Yeah, like the end of this regular season feels just like almost a formality. So maybe this is a chance for Matthews to obviously get the knee injury fixed and sorted out, but also all those nagging things, let him get to 100%. Because again, if you're a Leafs fan, you don't care if he finishes the season with only 25 goals. You want that guy scoring a ton in the playoffs. And here's a quick look, courtesy of dailyfaceoff.com, at what the Leafs lines could look like without Austin Matthews tonight as they take on the Ottawa Senators.
Way, Matt Murray in net for the Toronto Maple Leafs tonight, his first game since January 17th when he was pulled, and he's facing his former team, as you mentioned, in the Sens.
Interesting spot. Let's go to the other side of Canada, more or less, where Andrei Kuzmenko was given a new deal yesterday. A guy who it was talked about for the last couple of weeks. Are the Canucks going to maybe explore what the trade market is like on this guy? And they don't even really get all that close to doing it because we're over a month away from the deadline. And he signs a 2-year deal with an AAV of $5.5 million. Frank, does this deal make sense to you, or does it go against kind of the Canucks message that, hey, we're retooling?
Well, from a pure contractual standpoint, it makes sense to me. This is exactly sort of the window that we viewed Andrei Kuzmenko in when you go back to looking at the story that we ran through all the contract comparables. He was sort of right in that range between $5 and $6 million a year. There's a guy that's on pace for 74 points this season, and it's been an incredibly impressive showing for a guy that sort of entered as a relative unknown, clearly a talented player, but how would he adjust to life in North America, to the NHL, different games, smaller rink, all those things that you typically hear, and to do it at age 26. Well, they won the sweepstakes to get him.
Yep.
And now they're in the spot where they're saying, maybe we're looking at the trade market here and knowing that he was a pending UFA, thinking we're probably not going to get a whole ton here because this is a guy that you'd have to then re-sign. So I understand from this perspective why you'd want to keep him as compared to the potential trade return. But here's the part where I struggle with, and I think if you're a Canucks fan, you might also struggle with the idea that what does this team's salary cap picture look like moving forward? Because you have a bunch of wingers that are making in that $5 to $6.5 million range. And I think the thing is, we're looking at it through this current day prism, and Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford are probably looking at it through, the 30,000 foot view, or at least they should be, of these guys probably aren't going to be here. Brock Besser might not be here. Connor Garland might not be here. We're probably not going to have Bo Horvat, even though he's a center. So those are the types of conversations that I'd imagine the Canucks are having as they map out their plan into how they can retool into being a playoff team next season. Clearly, they felt like Kuzmenko and some of the chemistry that he's developed with Elias Pettersson is going to be one of those big things moving forward.
Here's the reason I like it from a Canucks perspective. You mentioned Garland and Besser, two guys who are, around the same price range, if not a little bit more expensive. Do either of those guys have point-a-game potential in your opinion?
Probably not. They don't.
Kuzmenko?
He does, but he's still a complimentary player.
Yeah.
He's not a driver, and he's a net front scorer that has adjusted really well. And not to say you don't need those players, but my point would have been from a cap flexibility standpoint, maybe you wait until after those players are gone before signing this deal to really know what you have moving forward in terms of your complete cap picture. Because I think that's the other part of it, is that they may want to move on from some of those players, but may not be able to.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's going to be fascinating to watch how the Canucks dance their way through the upcoming offseason and also the trade deadline. GM Patrick Allvin has his work cut out for him. Maybe a year from now, Frank, we'll be sitting here talking about Patrick Allvin as a potential GM of the year.
Maybe.
I don't know. Maybe a bit of a stretch, but that's our next topic, is looking back at sort of the year and what we've seen so far. Who is the GM of the year so far? If you had to hand out the award right now, Frank, who's at the top of your list?
If I had to hand out the award right now, it's an interesting one this year because I think there's lots of candidates and some teams that have been really good, but it would be Jim Nill of the Western Conference leading Dallas Stars, 650 point percentage. They've been one of the most consistent teams this year. And I think when I think of the GM of the year award, typically we always go after the GM that made the biggest changes to get his team into the playoffs. And that certainly would not be the case with Jim Nill because this roster is mostly the same. But the reason why I picked Jim Nill is to think of some of the landmines that he was able to successfully navigate through this past summer. Getting Jason Robertson a new deal, signing Jake Ottinger to a new contract that I think really fits that team for the long haul. And so when you think about the Stars and the pieces that they've assembled, it also goes back to that monster draft year that they had when they got all those guys and picked up, maybe one of the best draft classes that we've ever seen from an individual perspective. So to me, that's what stands out about the way Jim Nill has built the Dallas Stars. And I was kind of thinking, well, does Don Sweeney deserve some recognition for the team in Boston? Maybe the coaching change and trying to bring David Krejci back, for instance, the Hampus Lindholm trade that was made last year at the deadline. But it was a 107-point team already last year. I just think, I don't know, not knocking the Bruins at all. They've barely lost. They didn't really stand out to me in terms of that candidacy. Because there was also the Mitch Miller thing that popped up, and it was like, how do you wrangle with that? Who's your guy?
There's a couple at the top of my list. Ron Francis in Seattle obviously deserves a ton of love for what he's done. That Oliver Bjorkstrand trade is one of the moves of the entire summer. And then signing Andrei Burakovsky, a guy who's been on a couple of runs and knows how to win. And you add him into a young team, or a team that was still, I think, kind of searching for their identity a little after their first season in the NHL. I think those were both brilliant. I love what New Jersey did, the Vitek Vanacek deal. I mean, this is a guy who is outperforming his career numbers right now. And you got him for just a couple of picks, right?
Marino, I mean, that to me is maybe one of the steals of the summer was Marino in essence for Ty Smith.
And they've had this great season, and Andrei Palat hasn't been a part of it. And Andrei Palat is a guy who gets better when the playoffs roll around, one of the big clutch scorers of the last few seasons. So I think that's a move that could make Tom Fitzgerald look even better. But I want to throw a wild card at you. What about Brian McClellan in Washington? You're not buying it, but I look at Kemper. He's been great. They've been so banged up. No Backstrom, no Carlson for stretches, yet they're still in the playoff picture. He picked up Eric Gustafsson for basically nothing. He's been great. Picked up Dylan Strome off the scrap heap, and at points this year, Strome was their top-line center.
Yeah, I think he's done a nice job keeping them afloat, but I wouldn't say that he's vaulted them into any sort of contender status, and maybe that's to be expected with the contracts and terms that they have on the books, but in this case, it doesn't really jump out to me, but yeah, I don't know. This is, it's the best part about the GM of the Year award. Still so much to be determined. 35 days until the NHL's trade deadline. 5 weeks from today.
Yeah.
That this award is still TBD.
Yeah, and you mentioned Don Sweeney, and he's our next topic here because he has a fascinating decision ahead of him ahead of the trade deadline. And yesterday we talked about the Buffalo Sabres a bit, and it was, okay, Kevin Adams, do you risk disrupting the chemistry of your group to complement it and add to it ahead of the playoffs? And I look at this Bruins team. The vibes have been immaculate. Last dance vibes, right? That's the thing we're always throwing around with Krejci.
Aside from the loss on Thursday night. One of their few regulation losses of the season. Kind of crazy.
So if you're Don Sweeney, I'll start with this. Do you think he needs to take some consideration and I don't want to mess with the chemistry too much, or is it pedal to the floor, give this group everything they need?
I think that's what you do is last dance. Like, you don't want to leave any stone unturned. You don't want to get to the Eastern Conference final and fall short and say, geez, I really wish we had that extra center or that extra depth defenseman. And so if you take a look at what I believe are the Boston Bruins NHL trade deadline objectives, well, that top one is getting a center. And a potential target is Bo Horvat from the Vancouver Canucks. And no secret, this isn't the first time that the Bruins and Horvat have been linked. I think their interest in Bo Horvat actually goes back a full calendar year, that they're one of the teams that's sort of very quietly been keeping tabs on Horvat even before this magical season that he's had. And where it gets really interesting for the Boston Bruins is maybe you're able to do a lot of your shopping or all of your shopping for the deadline with one team. Go to the Vancouver Canucks and say, hey, we want Bo Horvat. We'll take Luke Schenn too. And we'll give you Brandon Carlo, or pick another defenseman on the Boston Bruins roster that, maybe they're willing to trade back a younger piece in order to make all of this work. And so that's sort of, even though Carlo isn't super, super young, he kind of fits what the Canucks are going after. And he's obviously been linked to the Canucks already as well. So that's the sort of, type of player that I think Boston, might be interested in moving. I think Carlo is a fine player, but he's someone that with his defensive instincts is never going to be a super big offensive contributor. And some might view him, I don't know, in the lines of a younger version of Eric Goodbranson or someone like that, but still a valuable piece to have around in your lineup. And if you're the Canucks and you're focused more on players instead of picks, well, that'd be one team that might be willing to do something like that. So Boston, for me, unbelievable year. I mean, we've rarely seen a team. They're on pace for 136 or 7 points. The record is 132. Like, they've got a chance to smash a long-standing NHL record. And man, it'd be crazy to see that team gear up and get even better. Horvat, the link between right now, Bergeron, Krejci, and then maybe adding his name to a Stanley Cup, and then sign him to a 7 or 8 year deal, link him with David Pastrnak, and the championship window remains open.
Yeah, you're right. It absolutely would stay open. The interesting thing with Carlo, too, $4.1 million cap hit, 26 years old. He fits kind of what you think the Canucks might like. And then also, if Vancouver's willing to keep 50% of Horvat or keep some amount of Horvat, boom, the money works because there's 4.1 going out the door for Boston as well. But a potentially all-in situation for Don Sweeney and the Bruins. It is fascinating for sure. Let's move along to our big segment today. Our friend Nick Alberga stopping by for some fantasy hockey talk. Nick Alberga swinging by. He's from Leafs Morning Take with Jay Rosehill. presented by Montana's Nick, the coaching bump, the new coaching bump. It is real. Matt Larkin wrote about that today on the site, but I want to get your take on that from a fantasy perspective. Out in Vancouver, who are a couple of Canucks that you're keeping an eye on now that Rick Tocchet's behind the bench?
Firstly, boys, great to be with you. Thanks so much for the invite. Great setup you got over there. Not so much of a great setup in Vancouver. I'm still chuckling over the fact that you beat Chicago and then you come out with an effort like that, and Rick Tocchet calls the performance weak and soft right off the bat. And I think he realized right then and there, yeah, this is going to be a difficult situation for me. To answer your question, I think ultimately you have to look at links from the past. And for me, you look at Connor Garland, you look at Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who have the history, of course, with Rick Tocchet down with the Arizona Coyotes. And I think you've seen the top 9 that he strolled out so far. You just talked about Boston. I think nobody in their right mind could have predicted Jack Studnicka to be a top-line winger, never mind for Boston, but now with the Vancouver Canucks. But he's playing with Horvat and Besser, Mikheyev, EP40, and Kuzmenko on line 2, and then Dries, Miller, and Garland on line 3. So ultimately, I wonder from a goal-scoring perspective how this will impact Vancouver, because they've been scoring tons of goals, of course, under Gabby Boudreau. I think defensively speaking, I would look at Thatcher Demko once he's healthy for Vancouver, maybe to solidify things and be a bit more stable defensively. But those are the two guys I would look at for an immediate bump, Garland and OEL.
Interesting, yeah, that maybe the connection with Tocchet going back to Arizona for Garland that, maybe gives him that bump. Yeah. Speaking of, we were talking earlier in the show, Nick, about injuries and how significant this one is for Austin Matthews, that keyword being minimum of 3 weeks that I think everyone has raised an eyebrow at. But from a fantasy perspective, if Matthews is on your team and now out for maybe the next month or so, even though it's not a ton of games missed thanks to All-Star weekend and the bye week, who would you be looking at? Who can fill some of the net for you?
Yeah, well, fortunately, Frank, there's a lot of guys who can help you out right now. And I think it's right of you to bring up that there's going to be 9 days off between games, including, All-Star and the bye week, as you mentioned, for the Maple Leafs. So that helps, I think, in the recovery for Austin Matthews. I think rest is never a bad thing when it comes to Austin Matthews. But from a fantasy perspective, he is a top 5, top 10 fantasy player, and losing him is pretty significant. So I think you look internally first and foremost. We see the lineup today in advance of round 2 of the Battle of Ontario game. Jay Rosehill and I will both be at in the alumni box tonight. Is Pontus Holmberg getting the bump up to the top 6? He's going to play with Yarncroke and Nylander. This means Michael Bunting back on power play 1. So there's tons of fantasy ramifications when it comes to the Maple Leafs and losing Matthews. But I think they're going to be okay. Like they've been able to weather the storm earlier this season when they lost guys like Riley and Muzzin and others on the back end. And I think it just depends on guys stepping up. So I'm very curious to see how a guy like Pontus Holmberg does. I'll tie this into the Josh Norris news earlier this week. Ridley Grigg is another guy we'll be watching tonight when the Leafs take on the Sens. Let's not forget, Frank, you know this. This is the guy the Ottawa Senators will not give up in a deal for Jacob Chychrun. His first game was pretty damn good. He got an apple on the power play and 8 shots on goal. And he's playing with the Brinket and Giroux on line 2. So I'm very curious in that file. And some other external options I would look at for replacement benefits. Kevin Hayes has a 4-game point streak, 8 points in his last 6. Joel Eriksson Ek has 6 points in his last 5. And Nick Schmaltz, the guy nobody talks about, he just racks up 60-point seasons. He has 7 points in his past 3, including a 4-point effort last night against St. Louis.
Yeah, Nick Schmaltz was fantastic last night. I had his shot prop of over 1.5, and he just went out and scored 3 goals. Quiet night. Yeah, nice little flex for me. I got to brag whenever I do happen to get bets right. Last one for you, Nick. It's kind of a quiet time now for fantasy hockey, but when the bye weeks and the All-Star break is over, it's crunch time for fantasy owners, and you will not make the playoffs. You will not go far in your playoffs if you don't have your situation between the pipes sorted out. Who are some goalies you're keeping an eye on right now?
Yeah, prayers for anybody who owns Frederik Andersen. I, for one, was feeling a Freddie Andersen contract year, but I don't know who's signing this guy. He's just always hurt. But I think it's a fortunate development, I would say, if there is a fortunate development anytime anybody gets injured. But Pyotr Kochetkov, if you took a flyer on a potential Calder trophy, well, he's going to be back in the mix now with Andersen going down. So you look at those 3 injuries right there, Talbot, Jari, and Andersen. Internally, those are the guys you want to pick up. Skinner's going to be tough. He's pretty much the number 1 at this point in time. Although I do like Jack Campbell, Casey DeSmith, Pyotr Kochetkov, as mentioned in the conversation as well. And I think when you look at Ottawa too, Anton Forsberg is another name I would bring up. Externally, like Dan Vladar, again, is another guy with the Calgary Flames. I think I would give him the lean over like a Jacob Markstrom. Seattle, that tandem I would look at. They've been on fire with Martin Jones and Philip Grubauer. Pavel Francouz, I know he loses to Anaheim last night, but I like the look there. I talked about Edmonton's tandem briefly. I like the power and the staying power of Edmonton here in the second half to go on a run. They're ready to start to do that already, and I think defensively they've been much improved. And then UPL with the Buffalo Sabres. You talked about Buffalo. Like, they just keep winning and winning and winning. And I wouldn't be shocked if they just somehow upset the Boston Bruins in round one. That'd be a great story, wouldn't it?
Oh, man, that'd be something.
Yeah, UPL.
Yes. All right. Nick Alberga, fantastic insight in fantasy hockey talk, brought to you by Montana's. This weekend, you're looking for some good barbecue? Montana's has you covered. They're also bringing back the viewing party. So if you're looking for somewhere to watch a game, you can head to Montana's. Montanas.ca for their full lineup of daily deals, or to check out their brand new comfort menu. Look at that. Daily drink deals throughout the weekend. The comfort menu does not get any better than that. Montanas.ca. Nick Alberga, thanks for your time, man.
My pleasure. Rosie's flying in right now. We're hitting up Montana's pregame. Let's do it.
Woo! Good living. Moving along to our daily face-off inbox question, hashtag AskDFO. Frank and I are getting in the Nation truck after this, and we are beelining it to Jasper for the Tourism Jasper and Fairmont Jasper Park Lodge Pond Hockey Tournament. The question, Frank, we got 3 games on Saturday. How many times do you find in the back of the net?
So what is the typical game score with the pond hockey with the small nets?
I would set an over-under for an average game at like 15.
Okay. So if I set my goal total for Saturday at 5, would you say over or under? Knowing that you've never seen me play.
And you're going to be a D-man for us, but there's lots of opportunities to jump up 5. I think I'll go over. I think you can get 6. I think you can be a 2-goal-a-game guy in this kind of setup.
I like it.
There you go. Some offense from...
I'm just hoping that whoever is running this tournament, Tourism Jasper, Canadian Hockey Enterprises, please make sure you have some, paddles, an AED device over here at the side of the pond for this guy who hasn't played anything competitive in a while.
Frank's going to be working hard this weekend, and we're going to have a good time. Keep it locked on our socials at Daily Faceoff to see some content from there. Let's move on to our daily bet segment, brought to you by Pointsbet Canada. It was a good night for me with the shot prop parlay. Nailed that again. It
was a good night for you at the casino last night.
Hey,
we had a night. We had a night.
We know how to live it up in Edmonton. Let's move along to what we like, or what I like tonight on the slate, courtesy of our friends at Pointsbet Canada, Vancouver and Columbus. I like this over, and a lot of people are liking the over because it's starting to shift that way, but I'm still going to lay a little on the over 6.5 between these two sides. Could be Colin Delia against Jonas Korpisalo. Listen, these two teams have been bleeding offense throughout the season. Korpisalo was great against Edmonton. If he gets a start tonight, I don't like him to have back-to-back good games. It just hasn't been that kind of a season for him. So I like playing the over here. And I also have a shot prop parlay for this evening's slate as well. A couple of players I like in this one. Riley Smith of Vegas to go over 1.5. He's been crushing it as of late. I think that is a very, very solid spot. And for the Seattle Kraken, Vince Dunn. It's set at 1.5. So if you play these two together, you're getting it like plus 125 on PointsBet. Vince Dunn has had 3 shots in 3 of his last 5 games. So expecting him to just get 2. Why not? And Frank, let's wrap it up with some garbage time.
Yeah, and by the way, Vince Dunn, only the second most popular Vincent on defense in the Pacific Division. So
yeah,
there you go.
Vinny Desharnais making a name for himself in Edmonton. I like that.
Yeah, he really has been. Garbage time. Let's pull up this clip from Thursday night's game between the Caps and Pens. And I wish there was one of those player puck and tracking distance trackers on Alex Ovechkin, because hit the clip, Alex. Watch just how far, or more to the point, how little Alex Ovechkin moves during this entire sequence on the power play. He's not even striding. Like, he's not even gliding anywhere. He's just standing there. Boom. That's it. All
it's crazy.
You need. It's unbelievable that they watched him, knew exactly where he was going to be, and yet he still finds the back of the net anyway. I'm telling you, he traveled maybe 5 feet total, if that, in an entire 17-second sequence.
And the wild part too, like getting a chance to watch him in person earlier this year and just keep your eyes solely on him. Even on those power plays when the other team ices the puck, he just goes to the other side of the blue line. Like, he'll only go 25 feet outside of the blue line and then drift right back into his spot. And it's crazy that all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of goals later, we're still doing this, and we're still in awe about what Ovechkin's able to do on the power play.
The magic of efficiency is what I would say. Like, some people might look at that and say, oh, that's incredibly lazy. Why didn't he move around and try and find a better opening? That guy is a master class in terms of efficiency. And I just can't believe, to your point, that we're continuing to talk about him scoring from the same spot on the same power play with the same guys feeding him every single time. So garbage time, I would say that is garbage penalty killing by a Pittsburgh Penguins team that should have done or should have known a lot better.
I was going to say that's going to be how much you're moving by our third game on Saturday.
Ooh, you're probably not wrong. Like, I'm like fully expecting to be going home on Monday hurting.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us will be. It's going to be a good time. That's going to be a wrap on our 2 in-person shows of Daily Faceoff Live this week. It was an absolute pleasure. Shout out to everyone watching along on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter this weekend. Make sure you keep it locked on dailyfaceoff.com for all your hockey needs. Enjoy a good weekend of hockey. Enjoy the All-Star break as well. And we'll be back next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.